Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so today we're going to study chapter 5. I just need two persons to read. And this morning, Bryce was on and he wanted to read, but I had seen two other persons. So I've promised Bryce this evening he will read. So Bryce wants to read the second part, which is 9 to 14. So would
I'll read the
someone read?
first part.
You read the first part, Marilyn? Very good.
Yep.
All right, let's go. That's easy.
Okay. On the third day of her fast, Esther put on her royal robes and went and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace, facing facing the throne. The king was inside, seated on the royal throne, facing the entrance. When the king saw Queen Esther standing outside, she won his favor, and he held out to her the gold scepter. She then came up and touched the tip of it. "What is it, Queen Esther?" the king asked. "Tell me what you want, and you shall have it, even if it is half my empire." Esther replied, "If it please your majesty, I would like you and Haman to be my guests tonight at a banquet I'm preparing for you." The king then ordered Haman to come quickly so that they could be Esther's guest. So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. Over the wine, the king asked her, "Tell me what you want, and you shall have it. I will grant your request, even if you ask for half of my empire." Esther replied, "If your majesty is kind enough to grant my request, I would like you and Haman to be my guests tomorrow at another banquet that I will prepare for you. At that time, I will tell you what I want."
Thank you, Marilyn. Go ahead, Bryce.
Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Xerxes his wife, and boosted them upon his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors of the king that had given him and how he had been prominent over all the nobles and the officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she invited me in to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Then he added, "But that's all worth nothing, as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting there at the palace gate." So Haman's wife Xerxes and all of his friends suggested that setting up a sharp pole that stands 70 feet tall, and in the morning asked the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this was done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole to be set up.
Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, Marilyn.
Uh-oh.
Now, last week, um, um, after the edict had been sent out to the whole kingdom, the whole empire, that at the end of chapter 3, Haman and the king were celebrating over a drink, and Susa was in confusion, and the Jews in chapter 4, where we began last week, were in mourning. And you find that Mordecai is the representative of the Jews because he is wailing, gnashing his teeth loudly and wearing sackcloth and ashes, and all the other Jews are doing the same thing, which is the way they are grieving, the way how they grieve. And so we see in last week's chapter 4 that Mordecai, that Esther, Queen Esther was told that Mordecai was outside, dressed quite razzily and crying, and she sent to find out what was going on. In fact, before she sent to find out what was going on, she sent him some clothes so that he can change. And that is when then she found out that he did change, and she needed to find out more of what was going on. And what we find is that there's this dialogue between Esther and Mordecai, but it's being mediated through her servant Haggai. And what we found out is that Mordecai had quite a lot of knowledge about what took place between King Xerxes or King Ahasuerus and Haman about the destruction of the Jews. And so we find here that with Esther, Esther obviously was told by Mordecai that this is the time for you to reveal your identity as a Jew so that you can save your people. And Esther sent back word to Mordecai through Haggai to say, well, if I do that, if I go before the king without being summoned by him, I can face death. And 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 she even said that, well, I haven't been before the king for a whole 30 days, so I don't know what's going on with this man. And so the thing about it is that if she if she goes before the king, she could die. And here we have Mordecai saying to her, well, this is what you need to do, because don't think that because now you're a queen that you're going to be snug in the palace and nothing will happen to you. And he tells her straight that God will still deliver them, God will still save them through another means, but she and her family will die. And then he ends it up with telling her that maybe the purpose for why you became queen is for you to be able to save your people at a time like this. And um, and and so with that in mind, she accepts to go before the king and to tell Mordecai that he needs to tell all the Jews of Susa to fast with her and her maids for 3 days. And then when those 3 days are passed, she will go before the king, and if she perishes, she perishes. And Mordecai carried out her instructions. So now we come now to chapter 5. And one of the things, even before I start chapter 5, is, and I think I may have mentioned it the last time we did chapter 4, is that as I said, I keep saying, I want you all to realize in this book, how do we fit into this book as well? And I say that in terms of, for example, we read here about Mordecai saying what could have been the purpose of Esther in terms of saving her people. And we too have to ask ourselves, what is our purpose in life? Because we all have purposes once we're alive. And sometimes we can't see it for ourselves. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we need someone to tell us. Sometimes we don't. So, always look at those kinds of things as you read this book as well. And this is where you see the hand of God, the providence of God being realized in the book as well. So we come to chapter 5, and presumably the fast has ended. Queen Esther is now taking the courageous step of approaching the king, although she was not summoned by him for quite a while. And we find in verses 1 to 3, it reads, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. So here we have the queen. She's put on her royal apparel, obviously dressed as attractively as possible as queen. And she goes before the king. I have no doubt she was fearful, but at the same time, she also went with faith that God will protect her and that God will prevent her from meeting her death. But even although you may have the faith, sometimes you could still be fearful. And so for me, I think that both that she was clothed in her royal robes, but she was also clothed in her faith, that she will be fine. And she stands in a conspicuous place, in the inner court, so that and we realize that she doesn't go into the hall where the king into the king's hall. She stands outside the king's hall. She stands in the court. So it's like she's standing in the vestibule but in a position that the king could see her from where he is sitting on the throne. Um, Maybe if she had gone right into the hall, who knows what would have happened. But she stands outside, which means that she respects the king and she respects her position as the queen, and so forth. So she goes to the inner court, and he sees her in the court, obviously from a distance, and she wins his favor, and he extends the gold scepter to her. Um, and the reason for extending the gold scepter is a sign that he acknowledges her and he welcomes her to come and see him, and which means then that the whole notion of her being put to death will probably not happen, because he's welcoming her, he is acknowledging her presence, and so if he had not extended the gold scepter, it could have resulted in her death. And and this takes place even though she disobeys the royal law or protocol in appearing before him, which is a sign. And we see the signs of God in this book. It is a sign that God was in the midst of what she was about to do and say, because really she could have died. And the fact that she doesn't, it shows that God is the one who is guiding her in this process, who is with her in this process, so that she does not meet her death. And it also shows God in another way as well, because it also tells us that the king's heart is in the hand of God, because God is also guiding him, because he does not say, well, off with her head, so to speak. He welcomes her, he acknowledges her. So again, God is controlling him. And if we were to read Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1, it tells us the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. So it is so fitting that in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1, we see this where the heart of the king is in God's hands and he can do whatever he likes with it. And we see it happening here in the book of Esther in this chapter 5. Now, um, uh, it is interesting, and we realize and we remember that we're dealing with a very impulsive king who does whatever he feels, whoever acts off the moment, doesn't think about anything or what have you. And so I think he's so happy in a sense to see Esther and her risky behavior, that she is richly rewarded. And the king offers her whatever she wanted, even half of his kingdom, half of the empire. And it is interesting, because another place in the Bible we find a king offering half of his kingdom as well. Who can remember where that is? Who's another king that offered half of his kingdom when a request was made of him?
I have no idea.
Anybody? Anybody wants to take a guess?
I would guess Solomon, but was it Solomon? David?
No.
Oh,
Okay.
who is it?
It was, wait, I can't hear you, Pam, on mute.
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember the name. Herod, right? It was
Herod.
to
It
his
was
daughter.
Herod.
His
It was
daughter.
Herod's
Herod.
daughter, correct. It was
Yes.
Herod. Herod in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6. You remember when the daughter had performed, and he told her, ask for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And even half of my kingdom, he told her. And she went back to her mother.
Yeah, but she said, I want the head of the.
She went
Yeah, I
back to
want
the
the head
mother.
of
Yeah,
but
she
she
went-
said. Yeah, she said, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and I
she-
also want him to be beheaded.
Yeah, she went back to her mom and to ask the mom what should she request, and the mom says, I want the head of John the Baptist.
Ew,
And,
gross.
and
That's disgusting.
and although and although she did not, the king himself, Herod himself, did not want to kill John because he very much thought that John was a holy man and a man of God. But again, he had already told the others and the other people who were with him that he would give her whatever she wanted. And so he could not go back on his word. And that is how John the Baptist was killed. But I'm just mentioning that to show that these kings like to offer a lot. And the thing is about it is, as I told the class this morning, I don't think it is so much that the king is going to offer his palace or his kingdom per se, but that what he's trying to say is that it is quite likely your request will be honored. So if you're, I mean, if anything that comes between um, nothing and half the kingdom, obviously, if he's willing to give that much as wide a range of answering your request, that he will offer, he will extend, or he will agree to whatever you request, and not
Ugh,
necessarily that he will give half of his kingdom. So
just
so
disgusting.
so we find and also so we find that it is an exaggerated offer. It doesn't. I don't, for me personally, I don't think it believes exactly what it means, but it just means that I'm willing to give you, I'm willing to offer your request. So just let me know what it is. So,
Ugh, that's just
and,
disgusting.
and so we find then that that is where that was the king's first um, question about why Esther was there. What is your request? And then when we go on to verses 48, it reads, if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. And Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. And it is interesting because the queen cleverly asks for nothing after the first request, than the opportunity for her to entertain her husband and Haman. And you can tell they're both pleased about the hospitality. And at that banquet, which is now, I think that was the sixth banquet, um, that I think, let me make sure that I'm right. I think that was the sixth banquet that, yes, the sixth banquet that Esther was, and Esther's first banquet. Remember, Vashti had a banquet before. This is now Esther's first. And someone said to me this morning, oh my golly, a banquet with 3 people. Well, we always have banquets then. But you see, and I said to the person, I said, but you know, these banquets, they were flowing with food and wine. I am sure much more do you have for 3 people at your house, because these folks dealt with abundance. But here we have Esther holding her first banquet, and it's for her husband and Haman. And you will find that the second banquet that she will hold, that will come up in chapter 7, will be the same as well. But we also hear the king, and he repeats it, that he will give to Esther whatever her request is. So we are hearing that also a second time. Um, and when he does ask, at the banquet, the second request, you could tell in verse 7 that Esther is like about to say what her request is, but then she deviates because she says, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. And then she goes to say, if the king regards me with favor and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come together to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's request. So you can see that, and as I said to the group this morning, I said, sometimes we wonder why would Esther take so long to make her request known, knowing full well that her people's lives are at stake. And sometimes, I said that sometimes even us, we know in our heart we have to say something, or not necessarily say something, but we know we need to do something, but it isn't the right time to do it. The Spirit doesn't lead us to do it at that point in time. And therefore, you need some more time so that God can move us to do it in the right time so we will get the best result. It is quite possible that if she had done it then, the king may have moved away from his request. But the fact is that from his decision to help, but to grant her request. But the thing about it is that here we find that instead of being impulsive, Esther becomes strategic. And she, instead of dashing off and saying what she wants right away, she builds up toward it. And there's a reason why there's the build up as well, because God was probably pushing her in that direction, because although she invites them to a second banquet in chapter 5, that banquet doesn't take place until chapter 7. And we will see next week in chapter 6 that a whole situation evolved that is going to make, you can tell that this was a God incident taking place, that God was in the midst of this whole thing, and we will talk about that next week. So we can only speculate that Esther's reason for delaying her answer to the king's request until he had asked it a third time is because of a God incident, a God intervention, where it keeps the whole story in suspense, which is what it will be to looking at it from face value, but it also allows us to see further information of the type of character Haman is, how he is so proud about himself, and how Mordecai will be honored before he even gets to that banquet. Was one other thing I wanted to just mention here. Maybe I might remember when I get back to later. And so then we get into now verse 9, where Haman, and we read, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, head full of wine. Man, these are not now the Holy Spirit. This is the other spirits that he had. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. So what we are having here now is that we see that having dined with the king and the queen, Haman is full of himself. He's delighted at being the honored guest of the queen at the queen's banquet, but his delight will soon be short-lived. That even although he had a special time with the queen and the king, when he sees Mordecai, it makes him angry. And it makes him angry because Mordecai once again refuses to do obeisance to him. And we will see that if we remember in chapter 3 and verses 2 to 5, when Haman got angry when Mordecai was standing up, but he would not bow to him. Now in chapter 5, Haman is angry because Mordecai is seated and would not stand up to honor him. So it is interesting to see the dichotomy between and what is going on here in the book. But Haman restrains himself. He went home. And maybe he probably tried to restrain himself too, because he knows that he had already sent out a decree, an edict, to get rid of the Jews, which will mean get rid of Mordecai, and he wouldn't have to put up with this for too much longer. And so he doesn't fuss over it after he just goes home, but you could tell obviously that he is still upset. One of the things we are not told here when Mordecai is seated, whether or not Mordecai is still in mourning. We don't know for sure if he's still wearing the sackcloth and ashes. But it is quite possible that he may not have been, since the fast had passed, and it would be most likely by now that Mordecai might have heard that the queen had gone in to the king and she did not die. And so if he felt that if he had this knowledge, since he seemed to know everything, if he had this knowledge, then he might have felt that God is going to save people and to save him, since Esther was not killed when she went before the queen. So it could have been a situation where that Mordecai believed that Esther's life and the life of the Jewish nation will be spared, and that God was in the midst of all that was going on, and therefore there was no longer any anxiety to be pacing up and down the courtyard, wondering what will happen. So it is quite possible that Mordecai was not mourning anymore, although we are not sure. When we get to when Haman gets home, and he with his friends and his wife, he boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and Haman had 10 sons. And one thing in the Bible is that your wealth, part of your wealth was measured by the amount of sons you have. I mean, you can also have daughters, but they didn't play the role as how the sons did. And he had 10 sons. So to have 10 sons, you were a pretty wealthy person in those days. And he also boasted about the ways the king had honored him, how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials, and even went on, that's not all. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. I mean, just think about it. He is happy that he's the only person. He's proud. He's boasting. He feels special. That this is what is happening with him. But the thing about it is, although he has many accomplishments, we see in verse 13, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So even with all the banquet with the king and the queen and eating and drinking and having fun and all of that, the man can't get Mordecai out of his mind. And I'll tell you this, there are people who are like that, where they have a lot, but they're still not contented. And this is where you see Haman has a lot. He boasts about his wealth, boasts about his sons, he boasts about dining with the queen, and he will do it again the next day. But yet he is not contented within himself because of the person of Mordecai. And as I say, there are folks who are like that in the world, who depend nothing. It doesn't matter how much they have or what they have, they still are not satisfied. So that's another thing to gather from this. One of the other things that we will realize is that it prepares us for what Jesus says in the Gospels, where he says, those who humble themselves will be exalted. those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And we see Mordecai's humility will be exalted, because later in the book, Mordecai will be honored twice by the king. And Haman's exaltation of himself, Haman's pride of himself, is now beginning to show, is going to lead to his destruction and his death. So those who humble themselves will be exalted. Those who exalt themselves will be humble. And again, this again shows you the whole God providence working within this book, because this is something that Jesus himself will later reveal.
Father,
Yes, please, Iris.
I know people like you were talking about, and they're very bitter.
Yes, yes. And Haman was.
Yes, it's a terrible thing. You know, the
Yes,
bitter
it
about
is. It is. And it eats away at your soul. You are never contented or happy or joyful or nothing. And no matter whatever you have, it still doesn't matter. And so and here we have a perfect example in the man Haman, the way he is responding. So you are absolutely correct, Iris. Um, so we then have in verses 14 and in verses 14 where it ends, where it says, his wife Jeress and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hang on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. So an irritated Haman, at the bidding of his wife and friends, they tell him, why not build a gallows? Now, obviously, the gallows was not 75 feet high, unless they put the gallows on top of a hill and measure the top of the gallows and the hill itself, and that was 75 feet. But it has to be hyperbole here that you'll be building a gallows. The ironic thing about the gallows is that you're building a gallows for someone else, and the gallows is going to end up to be your gallows, which is very interesting indeed. And the other thing about it is that even though he goes ahead and he builds a gallows, even though the king is the only person who could condemn people, who can put people to death. So he goes and he prepares gallows, but only the king can condemn Mordecai. And this is where it becomes interesting, because when we get into chapter 6, we will see that Mordecai, by the time Haman gets to him, Mordecai has a whole different vision. Sorry, not Mordecai. The king has a whole different vision of Mordecai, not knowing who. And this is where the whole thing is going to turn around, and it goes back to, like, don't count your chickens before you hatch, or what goes around comes around, or whatever the case may be. But you have this whole situation where, and this is where God's providence comes in again, because Haman is going to be going to the king in the morning to talk about this, and the king, when he walks in, we can hear a different story. So where Haman thinks now that he will get rid of Mordecai, and then he can go and enjoy the second banquet with Esther and Xerxes, and then he wouldn't have to come out and face Mordecai, because he would have been wiped off the face of the earth. It's going to be a whole different ball game in chapter 6. So that's where we will end tonight.
Well,
yes, questions?
He doesn't realize the connection between Mordecai and Esther.
It is interesting you asked that, Maureen, because someone asked that same question this morning, and no, he doesn't. I don't believe he knew, because obviously if he knew, if he wanted them still killed, he would have had to tackle it from a different way. He did not know that the queen was Jewish. and by not knowing, and we will, if you read the whole book already, you will know he begs the queen for his life, but to not. So no, he doesn't know that and he doesn't know that Mordecai is, as you said, that Mordecai is connected to the queen either. He does not know that. See, because they know Mordecai is a Jew, but they didn't know the queen is a Jew. So obviously they would not have thought that the queen was connected to him.
Mm.
The queen will not reveal who she is until chapter 7.
Wow.
Oh, Mordecai, that's what he stressed. And Mordecai said, do not tell them you are Jewish. Remember when
Correct, correct.
into the
Although,
heart? Yes.
correct. But although when it comes to chapter 4, he tells her it is time to reveal your identity, because you have the purpose, your purpose is to save your people. So in chapter 4, he does tell her it's time to reveal your identity, but that identity is not revealed until chapter 7.
That's what the book.
Well, I'm not hearing you, Maureen. Say that, please.
Reading Esther is like reading a mystery.
It is. It
Yes.
is. Or soap, or watching a soap opera.
Yeah.
Yeah, soap operas are boring, please.
But Esther is not boring, though. Esther's not boring, but
No, but I
it
hate
is
soap
a mystery.
operas, please.
Yeah.
Soap operas I don't like. I'm sorry, Father. I never liked them ever.
But that's not all right. That's all right. That's all right. but
No,
you were
I'm
saying
just saying soap
Maureen?
operas are kind of boring, all right?
All
They're
right,
like
Bryce.
boring.
All right, Bryce. Yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
Going to Pennsylvania on my way south, and I'm going to stop in at Sight and Sound Theater, and I'm pick up a copy of their thing of Esther, and I'll bring one to you.
You'll pick up a cup of what?
Copy of their program of Esther.
Oh, nice.
I'll
Yes.
bring it down to you.
Please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Children, because it's a wonderful, wonderful.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah. So any other questions?
Nope.
All right. Well, you're getting dinner early tonight. All right. Well, have a good night. And next week, well, when I send out the email for next week, I will let you know if we're doing only chapter 6 or 6 and 7. But most likely, probably, I would like to see if we can do both chapters. And so have a good night. Pam, thank you so much as well, always for hosting. And everyone have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Good night.